Jack Callahan had never been one for crowds. After his wife's death a year ago, the silence of his ranch seemed less lonely than the hum of town. The wide plains stretched endless and empty before him, a reflection of the hollow ache in his chest. He woke each day before dawn, tending to the cattle and fixing fences with hands roughened by years of work, yet his heart felt raw, untouched by the daily chores. The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying memories like ghosts he couldn't shake. He'd been married only 5 years before sickness took his wife, Mary, leaving him with a grief as deep as the rivers beyond the hills. Their small cabin still stood near the edge of the property, dark and quiet, untouched since she passed. Jack avoided it now, too full of memories he wasn't ready to face, but even the solitude couldn't hold back the loneliness forever. His horse, a stubborn old gelding named Scout, was a loyal companion, but the man longed for something more, something he wasn't sure he could find again. One gray morning, a storm was rolling in. Jack saddled Scout and decided he'd go into the nearest town, Davenport, to get supplies before the weather turned worse. The journey was a slow ride over cracked earth, dust curling behind them. The town was small but lively, with wooden storefronts and a saloon filled with laughter and the occasional clinking of glasses. Jack tied Scout outside the general store and stepped inside. The scent of leather, tobacco, and old wood filled the air. He nodded to the shopkeeper, an elderly man named Harris who always greeted him with a weary smile. "Anything special you need, Jack?" Harris asked. "Just the usual. Flour, beans, a bit of sugar," Jack replied. Watching the rain begin to fall lightly outside, as he waited at the counter, Jack overheard 2 women speaking softly nearby. One was older, with sharp eyes and a voice full of scorn. The other, younger, sounded weary, almost broken. "I hear Clara's still living under her in-laws' roof. Poor girl, with the way they treat her," the older woman said. "Beaten most days, they say. It's a wonder she's still standing." Jack froze. The name Clara hit him like a shot. He glanced toward the door, feeling an unfamiliar pull in his chest. "She's strong though, keeps it to herself mostly," the younger woman whispered. "But every time I see her, those bruises on her arms look worse. No one dares say a word. Her in-laws have everyone afraid." Jack's mind raced. He remembered the quiet woman he'd seen at the market weeks ago, her eyes hollow and distant, as if carrying the weight of the world. He'd assumed she was just another struggling soul in this unforgiving land. But now, the truth came crashing down on him. She was suffering, trapped in a place where no one came to her aid. The rain quickened, and Jack stepped outside, the storm pressing around him. He stared down the muddy streets, a fierce determination rising inside. He didn't know Clara, but he couldn't ignore what he'd heard. Something about her pain mirrored his own. Jack mounted Scout, the horse snorting nervously as thunder rumbled overhead. The storm was coming fast, but he couldn't ride home empty-handed, not this time. He needed to find Clara and see if there was a way to help, not just because he was a good man, but because in her suffering, he saw a chance to save them both from their lonely hells. The clouds rolled dark as Jack rode into the gathering storm, the first drops of rain mingling with the fire lighting in his heart. Somewhere out there, a widow was waiting for rescue, for hope, or maybe just a quiet kindness he was ready to offer. Jack Callahan wasn't a hero. He was just a man broken by loss, but ready to find a reason to live again. Clara Dawson sat on the creaking wooden porch of the Dawson homestead, the wind tugging at her thin shawl as if trying to rip it away. The setting sun painted the sky in bruised purples and reds, colors that matched the ache in her heart and the faded marks on her skin. She had lived here since her husband, Tom Dawson, passed away nearly a year ago. But she wasn't truly free. The old Dawson farm was ruled not by the land or weather, but by Tom's parents, Ruth and Hank, whose cold eyes and sharp tongues made every day a battle. They did not hide their disdain for Clara. In their eyes, she was little more than a burden, a reminder of their son's death. Every morning, Clara awoke before dawn to tend to the house and cook breakfast. She fed the chickens, chopped firewood, and washed the worn dishes with numb fingers. The chores were endless, and so were the insults and orders barked at her from inside the house. "Make sure that fire's burning," Ruth had snapped earlier that day, "and don't forget the laundry. Try not to spill the water." This time, Hank grunted, glaring as he passed by. The sharp sting of their words cut deeper than any bruises, though those weren't absent either. When the scolding turned to anger, so did the hands of her in-law. She bore the marks on her arms and back, carefully hidden beneath long sleeves and skirts, reminders of days when she had no voice and no escape. Clara's mind drifted to her daughter, little Mary. At 7 years old, Mary was a bright spot in her bleak world, her laughter a fragile melody that Clara clung to. But even Mary had begun to sense the tension in the house. The coldness that clung to every corner. Don't speak unless spoken to. Ruth warned one evening after Mary tried to ask about her father. The words sank like stones. Clara kept her head low in town, careful not to reveal the bruises or the fear. At the general store, she avoided the gaze of neighbors and whispered rumors. But some eyes lingered too long. She had caught glimpses of Jack Callahan's steady stare, a man known to keep to himself. Yet somehow different. She remembered the day she tried to walk to the church, seeking solace in prayer. Ruth's voice had stopped her at the door. "You think God's listening to a woman who can't even keep her husband alive?" she had sneered. Clara swallowed the lump in her throat, retreating back inside to a house that felt like a cage. Her only escape was the fields beyond the farm, where wildflowers grew untamed and the wind could carry her prayers. There, she let herself imagine a life free from pain and fear, a life where she could breathe without looking over her shoulder. But the days were long, and hope was a fragile thing. One afternoon, as Clara gathered water from the well, her in-laws approached, with harsh words and sharp hands. The sun was hot, sweat dampening her brow as she tried to stay silent. "You're worthless. Clara, without Tom, you're nothing," Hank growled. Ruth grabbed her arm roughly. "You'll never be part of this family." Clara bit her lip, refusing to cry. The pain burned deeper than the bruises. But somewhere inside, a spark flickered, a small voice telling her she deserved better. Later that evening, after the house had fallen into uneasy quiet, Clara sat by the window watching the stars emerge. She thought of Jack Callahan again, the man who'd looked at her not with pity, but with something steadier, stronger. She didn't know him well, but in a world full of harshness, his kindness was like a whispered promise. The road ahead was uncertain, and the fear of what might come if she left held her captive. But for the first time in months, Clara felt a glimmer of courage. She wasn't sure where that courage would lead. But she knew one thing. She could no longer endure the silence. Jack Callahan didn't usually spend time in town beyond quick trips for supplies, but lately, something had shifted. The image of Clara Dawson, her haunted eyes, and the bruises she tried to hide, lingered in his mind like a stubborn shadow he couldn't shake. It wasn't just sympathy. It was something deeper, something that pulled at his heart in a way he hadn't felt since Mary's passing. One cool morning, Jack tied Scout outside the general store again, hoping to catch a glimpse of Clara. He found her sitting quietly by the well, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of water, her eyes distant and wary. "Morning, Clara," Jack said softly, keeping his voice low. She looked up, startled. For a moment, her face was guarded, unsure if she should respond. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Morning, Mr. Callahan," she replied. Jack smiled gently, trying to bridge the distance between them. "The weather's changing fast. Might want to get inside before that rain hits." Clara gave a small, almost sad smile. "Thank you, I appreciate it." From that day on, Jack found reasons to visit the town more often. He'd drop by the store, linger a bit longer, or offer to help with odd jobs around the edges of town. Sometimes, he and Clara exchanged brief words, nothing too deep, just enough to keep the fragile connection growing. One afternoon, Jack was walking through town when he saw a group of men jeering at Clara near the dusty street. Her eyes were downcast, and her body tensed like she wanted to disappear. Before Jack could think twice, he stepped between her and the men. "Leave her alone," he said firmly, his voice low but commanding. The men looked at him, surprised by his sudden boldness. One stepped forward, sneering. "What's it to you, cowboy?" Jack met his gaze evenly. "She's under my protection now." The threat in Jack's tone made the men reconsider. They muttered under their breath and backed away. Clara looked at Jack, a mix of relief and gratitude shining through her pain. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack nodded, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. As days passed, Clara found herself looking forward to Jack's visits. There was a steadiness in him, a quiet strength that made her feel seen for the first time in a long while. He never pressed her to talk about her past or her troubles. He simply offered companionship and respect. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Jack invited Clara to sit by the fire outside the saloon. The warmth of the flames flickered across their faces, casting shadows that danced like old memories. "Tell me about Mary," Clara said softly. Jack paused, surprised. Not many ask. She must have been special. Jack nodded, a gentle smile tugging at his lips. She was the light in my life. Losing her. It broke something inside me. Clara's eyes softened. I understand loss more than most. They shared a quiet moment, the pain between them connecting rather than dividing. Slowly, an unexpected bond formed built on shared grief, mutual respect, and a cautious hope for something new. For Jack, it was the first step toward healing. For Clara, it was the first glimmer of safety she had felt in years. But both knew the road ahead would be difficult. The shadows of the past and the harsh judgments of their small town loomed large. Yet, for the first time, they dared to believe that together, they might find a way forward. The following days were a whirlwind of quiet plans and hesitant hope. Jack had offered Clara a chance at a new life, a place on his ranch, far from the cold eyes and cruel hands of her in-laws. But for Clara, the decision was anything but simple. She sat on the creaky kitchen stool in the Dawson farmhouse, the weight of the past pressing heavy on her chest. She glanced at the bruises she tried to hide under her long sleeves and thought of Mary, her little girl, caught in the crossfire of family hatred. Leaving meant freedom, but it also meant stepping into the unknown. Could she risk it? Could she trust Jack? That night, under the pale light of a waning moon, Clara made her decision. She packed a small bundlesome clothes, a few precious keepsakes, and a worn photo of her late husband. She kissed Mary's sleeping forehead, whispering a promise to keep them both safe. Then, heart-pounding, she slipped out of the house. The cool night air was a balm to her bruised spirit. She met Jack at the edge of town, where Scout waited patiently. His eyes softened when he saw her, a mix of relief, pride, and something deeper. Are you sure? He asked quietly. Clara nodded. I'm done hiding. The ride to the ranch was slow and cautious. The storm clouds from Jack's last trip into town had long since passed, leaving the stars clear and sharp overhead. Clara felt the wind brush against her face, carrying with it a whisper of hope she hadn't dared to feel in months. The ranch was a world apart from the cramped, suffocating farm she'd known. Wide open fields stretched to the horizon, dotted with grazing cattle and framed by sturdy fences. The cabin Jack called home was small but warm, its hearth glowing with a steady fire. Jack showed her around, his voice steady and patient as he explained the land and the chores. Clara listened, absorbing the unfamiliar sights and sounds, the creak of leather harnesses, the low murmur of cattle, the song of crickets in the night. It wasn't charity, Jack said. It was a partnership. She wasn't a burden here. That idea was new to Clara. For so long, she'd been made to feel like a shadow, an unwanted reminder. But here, she was beginning to breathe again. Days turned to weeks, and with each sunrise, Clara grew stronger. She learned to ride Scout with a careful hand, the reins firm but gentle. Jack taught her how to check fences and feed cattle. His patience was endless, his respect unwavering. One afternoon, as they worked side by side under the blazing sun, Clara felt something shift inside her. The pain of her past, while never far, began to soften beneath the steady rhythm of honest labor and quiet companionship. Jack noticed the change too. He saw the light returning to her eyes, the way her smile, though shy, was becoming more frequent. Still, Clara was haunted by fear, the fear of what might come if her in-laws discovered her escape. The fear of opening her heart only to be hurt again. But Jack never rushed her. He let her set the pace, offering kindness without demands. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset burn the sky gold, Clara finally spoke. I don't know if I'm ready to leave the past behind completely, she admitted. Jack reached out, his rough hand covering hers. You don't have to do it alone. Not anymore. In that moment, beneath the vast western sky, a fragile fire burned, a promise of new beginnings born from the ashes of pain. Together, they faced the uncertain horizon. And for the first time in a long while, Clara dared to hope. The morning sun spilled over the ranch, casting a golden glow across the fields. Clara stood by the fence, her fingers tracing the weathered wood, feeling the warmth seep into her skin. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was beginning to believe in a life beyond fear. The ranch was no grand estate, it was humble and worn, but it breathed with life and possibility. Jack moved with a quiet confidence, his every action measured yet kind. Together, they had built a rhythm, a daily dance of chores and quiet moments that stitched together the torn edges of Clara's soul. Come on, Clara, Jack called from the barn. Time to check the cattle. Clara smiled, her heart lightening. She grabbed her hat and followed him across the yard. As they walked side by side, Jack showed her how to listen to the low murmurs of the herd, how to watch for signs of trouble. She found herself laughing softly when Scout nudged her gently with his nose, sensing her growing comfort. The days were long and filled with work, but in those hours, Clara found healing. Each task a step away from the shadows of her past. Jack never pressured her to speak about the pain she carried. Instead, he offered presence steady, unwavering. When she felt brave enough, she shared small pieces of her story. Each one met with understanding rather than pity. One afternoon, after a long day in the sun, they sat on the porch, sipping cool water. Clara looked at Jack, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper shining in her eyes. "You've given me more than shelter," she said softly. "You've given me hope." Jack nodded, his gaze steady. "We both needed this." Their bond deepened in those quiet moments, the kind of connection that didn't need words to speak volumes. Clara began to dream again, imagining a future where she and Mary could thrive. Where love wasn't something to fear but to embrace. But the peace was fragile. Rumors began to swirl through the town, whispers of Clara's disappearance and the man who had taken her in. Some looked on with suspicion, others with quiet admiration. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack stood at the gate, watching the distant lights of Davenport flicker. He knew that their new life was a beacon for both hope and trouble. For Clara, the house breathed with life and possibility. For Jack, it was the start of healing. Together, they had found a fragile sanctuary. But the past was not done with them yet. The quiet of the ranch was shattered one late afternoon by the sound of hooves pounding hard against the dusty ground. Jack stood at the edge of the field, eyes narrowing as a group of riders approached fast. Clara's in-laws, Hank Dawson, led the posse, his face twisted with anger and resentment. Flanked by a few local men whose loyalty to the Dawsons ran deep. The look in their eyes was clear. They'd come to take Clara back. By force, if necessary. Jack tightened his grip on the reins, standing tall in the saddle. "What brings you here?" he asked coldly, his voice steady despite the rising tension. Hank spat on the ground. "That woman belongs with her family. We're taking her home." Clara stood behind Jack, her heart pounding but her stance firm. The months on the ranch had strengthened her body and soul. She was no longer the frightened girl who had slipped away in the night. She met Hank's glare without flinching. "I don't belong there," she said quietly but firmly. "I'm not going back." Hank sneered. "You'll regret this." Jack stepped forward. "She's under my protection now. You won't lay a hand on her." The tension crackled in the dry air. For a moment, it seemed violence was inevitable. Then, a voice rang out from the side. It was Sheriff Matthews, riding up with 2 deputies. "That's enough," he said sharply. "No one takes the law into their own hands." The sheriff's arrival surprised everyone. Word had gotten around about Clara's situation, and though many townsfolk had been silent before, some had begun to rally quietly in her defense. Ruth Dawson's face flushed with fury, but she said nothing. Hank cursed under his breath, but the sheriff's presence forced a reluctant retreat. That night, Clara sat by the fire, her hands trembling as Jack wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. You stood your ground. That's what matters." In the days that followed, Clara found strength she hadn't known she possessed. The support of Jack and some unexpected allies in town bolstered her resolve. She refused to let fear rule her life any longer. Her in-laws' threats grew quieter, replaced by grudging acceptance that Clara was no longer theirs to command. For the first time in years, Clara breathed freely. But the journey was far from over. The scars ran deep, and trust was fragile. Still, with Jack by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. The spring air was crisp and sweet with the scent of blooming wildflowers when Clara stood at the edge of the ranch, watching the sun dip behind the rolling hills. The land stretched endless and free, a world away from the shadows she had once known. Her hands were steady now, calloused not from fear but from honest work. She had learned to ride Scout like a seasoned cowhand, and each day, the weight of the past felt a little lighter. But it wasn't just the land or the work that healed her, was Jack. Their relationship had grown quietly, naturally, like the grass beneath their boots. There were no grand gestures or hurried promises. Instead, there was patience, respect, and a kind of love that felt as solid as the earth beneath them. One evening, after a long day on the ranch, Jack and Clara sat together on the porch, the fire casting warm shadows around them. Mary, Clara's daughter, sat nearby, her laughter a bright thread weaving through the night. Jack looked at Clara, his eyes soft and steady. "I never thought I'd find a reason to smile again," he said quietly. "But you," Clara cut him off with a gentle smile. "Jack, you didn't rescue me. We saved each other." He nodded. "That's right, we're partners." Clara reached out, taking his hand in hers. It was a simple gesture, but it carried everything: hope, trust, and a future they both dared to believe in. The days that followed were filled with small joys: the scent of fresh bread in the kitchen, the warmth of a fire on a cold night, the soft nuzzle of Scout's muzzle against Clara's cheek. The ranch became more than a refuge. It became home. The town slowly grew kinder too, their neighbors learning to see Clara not as a victim but as a woman of strength and courage. The whispers faded, replaced by respect. Clara's past was a chapter they would never forget, but it no longer defined her. She was a widow, no longer beaten down but lifted up by love, by choice, and by a man who saw her worth. On a quiet morning, beneath the vast blue sky, Jack and Clara stood side by side, watching Mary run freely across the field. Clara leaned into Jack, her heart full. "Thank you for giving me more than I ever hoped for." Jack smiled, pulling her close. "Thank you for trusting me." Together, they faced the horizon to broken souls made whole by a love that was gentle, fierce, and true.